The Ghost of 1973, The Paris Utopian Last Stand. Chapter 1, The Death of the Box. Welcome to Synapse Daily. Close your eyes. I want you to transport your mind back to March 1973. Imagine you are standing on the pavement of the Avenue de Champs-Élysées. The air is crisp, biting, and smells of diesel and expensive tobacco. But as you walk toward the Grand Palais, the atmosphere changes. It's no longer just the smell of a city, it's the smell of a revolution. Inside the halls of the 1973 European Utopian Architecture Symposium, the world as you know it is being dismantled. You hear a cacophony of voices, French intellectuals arguing with Italian radicals, British rebels shouting over German engineers. This isn't just a meeting. This is a funeral for the box. For 50 years, the world had been obsessed with modernism. We were told that a house is a machine for living in. We were told that concrete was the future. We were told that cities should be divided into neat, boring zones, work here, sleep there, shop there. But in 1973, the people in this room were screaming, enough. They looked at the gray, brutalist towers rising across Europe and saw prisons. They saw a world that had lost its soul to the grid. In this symposium, the air is thick with a dangerous question: what if a building didn't have to be a building? This was the peak of the 30 glorious years, the Trente Glorieuses. Since the end of World War II, the economy had done nothing but go up. Technology was moving faster than the human heart could handle. We had conquered the moon, we were splitting the atom, and we were beginning to believe that humans were gods. But these architects, these utopians, sensed a crack in the foundation. They knew that the dream of infinite growth was a lie. They came to Paris to design the new world before the old one collapsed. But how do you design a dream when the world is about to wake up to a nightmare? Chapter 2, The Radical Visionaries and the Plug-in Dream. Who were the giants walking these halls? To understand the madness of 1973, you have to meet the groups that treated blueprints like manifestos. First, you encounter the Archigram group from London. Led by Peter Cook, these men looked more like rock stars than architects. They didn't want to talk about bricks and mortar. They wanted to talk about flow. Their most famous concept, the plug-in city, was a direct challenge to the idea of a permanent home. Imagine a massive, miles-long steel framework that spans across a landscape. Within this frame, everything is modular. Your kitchen, your bedroom, your office, they are all individual capsules. When you get bored of your view or need to move for a job, a massive crane simply unplugs your room and moves it. It was a vision of a nomadic future where technology served human whim, not the other way around. Then, you see Yona Friedman. He was a man who survived the horrors of World War II and came out believing that the only way to save humanity was to give them total freedom. His spatial city, Ville Spatiale, was a dream of layers. He proposed building a secondary city above the existing ones. These structures would be suspended on giant pillars, leaving the ground level for nature or historical preservation. Friedman believed in mobile architecture. He didn't think architects should tell people how to live. He wanted to provide a skeleton, and let the residents build their own spaces within it. It was a radical democracy of space. But as you move through the room, the mood shifts. You meet the Italians, Superstudio and Archigram. They weren't optimists like the British. They were the dark poets of the symposium. Their continuous monument was a chilling vision, a sleek, white, windowless architectural grid that wrapped around the entire planet, crossing oceans and deserts. It was beautiful, but it was also a warning. They were saying, if we continue to let capitalism and technology run wild, the whole world will become one giant, sterile office building. Can you imagine the tension? On one side of the room, men are designing walking cities. On the other, they are warning that our designs might eventually swallow the earth. Chapter 3, The Ghost of May 68 and the Inflatable Spirit. To understand why these ideas were so explosive in 1973, we have to look back at the scars of Paris itself. Only 5 years earlier, in May 1968, the city had been a war zone. Students and workers had taken to the streets, tearing up the cobblestones to throw at the police. Their slogan? Under the paving stones, the beach. The 1973 symposium was the spiritual successor to those riots. The architects in that room were the same people who had been on the barricades. They saw traditional architecture as the ultimate authority. Walls are borders. Doors are gatekeepers. Towers are symbols of hierarchy. This led to one of the most fascinating trends of the era, the Inflatable Revolution. Why build something that lasts forever? If you build a stone building, you are claiming the land for 100 years. But if you build an inflatable structure, a pneumatic, you can set it up in an hour and deflate it in 10 minutes. The group Utopie, based in Paris, believed that air was the most radical building material. They created inflatable houses, inflatable furniture, even inflatable theaters. It was an architecture of the moment. It was light, it was cheap, and it was impossible for the government to control. It was the ultimate FU to the establishment. In the symposium, they argued that a truly free society must be a soft society. A society that can change its shape as easily as a balloon. But here is the question that started to circulate through the hallways: if everything is temporary, if nothing is solid, then what are we building for? Is a city without walls still a city, or is it just a crowd? Chapter 4: The Cybernetic Pulse. As we dive deeper into the symposium, we find a group of people who weren't looking at balloons or steel frames. They were looking at wires. In 1973, the computer was still a giant machine that filled an entire room. But the Utopians saw the future of the Silicon Age. They were obsessed with cybernetics, the science of feedback loops. They began to ask, can a building think? They envisioned adaptive environments. Imagine a room that senses your mood. If you are sad, the walls change color. If you are cold, the ceiling lowers to trap heat. If the room is too crowded, the walls literally expand. This wasn't science fiction to them, it was the logical next step of human evolution. They saw the city as a giant computer. A social machine. They wanted to use data to create a perfect balance between human needs and environmental resources. They were the first people to talk about what we now call smart cities. But there was a darker side to this electronic utopia. Some critics at the symposium pointed out the danger. If the city is a computer, who is the programmer? If the walls are watching you to adjust your mood, aren't the walls also spying on you? The dream of a house that thinks for you was only a few steps away from a house that controls you. As the sun set over Paris during the symposium, the debate grew more heated. The dreamers were at their peak. They had the technology, they had the passion, and they had the vision. They thought they were at the beginning of a 1,000-year era of radical freedom. They didn't know that in just a few months, the Fourth Arab-Israeli War would trigger an oil embargo. They didn't know that the price of energy would quadruple overnight. They didn't. Chapter 5: The Day the Lights Went Out, the Great Oil Crash. Imagine the symposium is ending. The architects are packing their slides, their inflatable models, and their radical manifestos. They are toasting to a future of infinite plastic and flying cities. But outside the Grand Palais, the real world is about to scream. October 1973. The Yom Kippur War breaks out. In response, OPEC declares an oil embargo. Suddenly, the infinite future of the Utopians runs out of gas. This is the single most important moment in architectural history that no one talks about. The Utopians loved plastic. They loved steel. They loved high-tech gadgets that required massive amounts of energy. But overnight, the price of oil quadrupled. Gas lines stretched for miles. In some European cities, driving was banned on Sundays. The inflatable revolution of the Utopie group suddenly looked like a disaster. How can you keep a giant balloon inflated when electricity is a luxury? The symposium in Paris was the last supper of the old world. The dreamers were planning for a world of abundance, but they woke up in a world of scarcity. The radical designs of Archigram and Friedman were suddenly viewed not as visionary, but as irresponsible. The world became cynical. Governments stopped funding experimental housing and went back to the cheapest, ugliest concrete boxes possible just to survive the winter. This was the death of the grand narrative. The belief that science and design could solve all human problems was shattered. But in the ashes of this collapse, something new, and perhaps more important, was born. Chapter 6: The Green Rebirth, From Plastic to Plants. If you look closely at the records of the 1973 symposium, you see a small, quiet shift in the later days of the event. While the giants were arguing about space cities, a new generation of eco-utopians was whispering in the corners. When the oil crisis hit, these whispers became a roar. Architecture shifted from how can we dominate nature with technology, to how can we survive within nature. This was the birth of sustainable architecture. Before 1973, solar panels were NASA technology. After 1973, the radical architects who were left in Paris began sketching buildings that were buried in the earth to stay warm. They started looking at windmills and natural ventilation. They realized that the utopia of the future couldn't be a plastic bubble. It had to be a forest. We see the roots of the modern Green New Deal right here in the failures of 1973. The visionary Paolo Soleri, though not always at the center of the Paris scene, saw his ideas of arcology, architecture plus ecology, gain massive traction. He wanted to build cities that function like biological cells. This transition was painful. It meant admitting that we couldn't just plug in a new city whenever we wanted. It meant admitting that the Earth had limits. Do you think we would be talking about carbon neutrality today if the 1973 crisis hadn't forced these geniuses to stop dreaming of space and start looking at the soil? Chapter 7: The Forbidden Blueprints, What Actually Got Built. You might think that because the symposium was utopian, nothing ever left the paper. But you would be wrong. The DNA of 1973 is hidden in plain sight all over the world. Take a look at the Centre Pompidou in Paris. It was under construction right around this time. It looks like a factory turned inside out. It has giant colorful pipes, moving escalators on the exterior, and a completely flexible interior. This is the plug-in city made real. It is a building that breathes and moves. Or look at the Nakajin Capsule Tower in Tokyo, rest in peace, as it was recently demolished. It was the literal embodiment of the modular, capsule living dream discussed in Paris. Each room was a prefabricated pod that could be replaced. But there are darker examples too. That continuous monument idea of the Italians, that world-spanning grid actually exists today. It's called the Internet. We don't live in a physical grid, but we live in a digital one. Every house, every phone, every person is plugged into a single, global structure. The utopians of 1973 predicted the digital cage we live in long before the first web browser was ever coded. What if the utopia they were looking for wasn't a place, but a state of being? They wanted a world where people were not defined by their geography. Today, you can work for a company in New York while sitting on a beach in Bali. Isn't that the mobile architecture Friedman was talking about? We didn't build his floating cities, but we built the digital infrastructure that made the physical city obsolete for many. Chapter 8: 1973 versus 2026, The New Utopians. Now, let's look at where we are today. In 2026, we are seeing a massive revival of these 1973 ideas. We have billionaires like Elon Musk talking about Mars colonies. We have Saudi Arabia building the Line, a 170-kilometer-long mirrored skyscraper in the desert. Does the Line sound familiar? It is almost an exact copy of the continuous monument from the 1973 symposium. The same radical, linear, world-defying scale. But there is a difference. The 1973 utopians wanted to free the individual. They wanted to destroy the state. They wanted the people to own the space. Today's utopias are often corporate. They are top-down. They are about efficiency and surveillance, not necessarily about the beach under the paving stones. When we look back at that cold March in Paris, we see a mirror. We see a group of humans who were brave enough to imagine a world that didn't exist. They weren't afraid to be unrealistic. In 2026, have we lost that? Are we too busy optimizing our current world to imagine a completely different one? The 1973 symposium teaches us that every failed dream leaves a seed. The walking city failed, but it gave us modular construction. The inflatable house failed, but it gave us lightweight, high-tech materials. The cybernetic city failed, but it gave us the smart city. The question isn't whether their ideas were correct. The question is, are we still brave enough to dream as dangerously as they did? Chapter 9, The Psychology of Utopia, Why We Crave Perfection. Why are we so obsessed with building a perfect world? During the 1973 symposium, a group of psychologists and sociologists sat in the back of the room, watching the architects frantically sketch their dreams. They realized that these blueprints weren't just for buildings, they were maps of the human psyche. The human brain is wired to seek order within chaos. Architecture is our most profound way of imposing that order. In 1973, the world felt like it was slipping out of control. The Vietnam War, social unrest, and rapid technological shifts made people feel small. Utopia was the cure. By designing a walking city or a floating cloud, these architects were trying to reclaim agency. They were saying, if the world is broken, we will simply build a new one. But there is a psychological trap in utopia. A perfect city requires perfect people. And humans are anything but perfect. One of the most intense debates in Paris centered on this: does the environment shape the person, or does the person shape the environment? The utopians believed that if you lived in a transparent, modular, and free space, you would become a transparent, modular, and free human. They underestimated our love for privacy, our messy emotions, and our tribal instincts. This chapter of the symposium was a mirror showing us that our designs are often just reflections of our own fears of being stuck. Chapter 10, The Forgotten Voices, Women of the Symposium. For a long time, the history of 1973 was told as a story of great men with big pipes and bigger ideas. But the archives tell a different story. Women architects and thinkers were there, and they were often the ones asking the most practical, yet radical, questions. While the men were designing mile-high towers, women like Denise Scott Brown, though her influence was often felt from afar, and various members of the Utopia collective were asking, where do the children play in a continuous monument, and how does a plug-in city handle the domestic labor of the home? They challenged the patriarchal structure of the city. Traditional cities were built for the male breadwinner, office in the center, home in the suburbs. The women of the 1973 era pushed forward non-sexist cities. They imagined communal kitchens, shared childcare spaces integrated into the architecture, and designs that broke the isolation of the housewife. They argued that a true utopia wasn't about flying cars, it was about the end of the lonely, isolated domestic life. In 2026, as we talk about 15-minute cities and co-living spaces, we are finally catching up to the gender radical ideas that were being whispered and sometimes shouted in Paris 50 years ago. Chapter 11, Radical Play, Turning Survival into a Game. One of the most out there concepts from the symposium was the idea of Homo ludens, the man who plays. The architects believed that technology, automation and early computers, would soon eliminate the need for human labor. If the machines do the work, what will we do? They asked. Their answer: we will play. They designed cities that were basically giant playgrounds. They envisioned buildings with slides instead of stairs, and walls that could be painted and repainted by citizens every day. The Dutch architect Constant Nieuwenhuis in his New Babylon project was the ultimate example of this. He imagined a world where no one owned anything, everyone moved constantly, and life was a continuous, creative performance. In 1973, this sounded like madness. But look at us now. We have gamified our lives. We earn points for walking, we compete for status on social media, and our work is increasingly done in creative, playful digital spaces. The utopians didn't realize that radical play would eventually be hijacked by corporations to keep us addicted to screens, but their core dream was beautiful, a life where your surroundings are a canvas for your imagination. Chapter 12, The Architecture of Silence. What happens when the machines stop? As the 1973 symposium reached its final hours, a somber realization hit the room. Every one of these utopias, the flying ones, the electronic ones, the inflatable ones, depended on one thing: power. What happens to a plug-in city if the electricity fails? What happens to an inflatable theater if the fans stop spinning? It becomes a tomb. This led to a sub-movement within the symposium, the architecture of silence. These were the designers who looked at ancient ruins. They looked at stone, at thermal mass, at the ways our ancestors lived for thousands of years without a single watt of power. They realized that true resilience isn't high-tech, it's low-tech. They began designing buildings that used the sun for heat and the wind for cooling, not because it was eco-friendly, but because it was the only way to ensure the utopia survived the inevitable collapse of the industrial age. This was the moment architecture regained its humility. It was no longer about conquering nature, but about listening to it. Chapter 13, 1973 as a survival guide for 2026. So, why does this matter to you, listening to this podcast in 2026? Because we are living in a time of permacrisis. Climate change, AI taking over jobs, and the rising cost of living have made us feel just as desperate as the people in that room in Paris. The 1973 symposium is our survival guide. It shows us that mobility is freedom, we need to design our lives and cities to be flexible. Modular is sustainable, we should stop building permanent monuments and start building things that can be recycled and moved. Community is the grid, the most important infrastructure isn't fiber optic cables, it's the social bond between people. The Utopians failed to build their cities, but they succeeded in opening our minds. They proved that the status quo is just one choice among many. If we don't like the world we live in, we have the right and the duty to imagine a better one, no matter how unrealistic it seems. Chapter 14, The Synapse Daily Final Verdict, The Dream Never Dies. We've traveled through the smoke-filled halls of Paris, seen walking cities, felt the chill of the oil crisis, and looked at the digital cages of the modern world. The 1973 European Utopian Architecture Symposium wasn't a failure. It was a seed. It was the moment humanity tried to leap into the future and realized we didn't have wings yet. But we started building those wings. Every time you see a green roof, a modular home, or a decentralized community, you are seeing a ghost of 1973. The box is still here, but it's cracking. And through those cracks, the dreams of Paris are still leaking through. History isn't just a list of dates. It's a relay race. The visionaries of 1973 ran their lap and passed the baton. Now, the baton is in your hands. What will you build? What will you dream? And most importantly, what are you willing to change? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. This has been Synapse Daily. Like this video if you learned something new. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more fascinating stories.